everybody. My name is Assis Malakias. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to the Africa Sessions. The main objective of the Africa Session series of virtual conferences, part of a global strategic platform, is to foster analytical dialogue between experts on critical and timely themes using an online platform to bring the discussion to a wide global audience. Besides live transmissions, the conferences will be available on social networks for later viewing and may be used for production of written materials. The African sessions are held monthly, and the main participants are analysts, academics, government officials, journalists, and other opinion makers. The target audience includes academics, business leaders, government officials, analysts, students, and the general public. In terms of the format, the Africa sessions offer about 60 to 90 minutes of online debates with experts and moderators. COVID-19 provided the impetus for this important initiative. Among other things, the pandemic exposed serious deficits in terms of strategic thinking to address global challenges. The Africa sessions, and more broadly, the global strategic platform, will go a long way to help alleviate these deficits. Today's theme is Africa after COVID-19, private sector development. It is expected that Africa's growth prospects will weaken significantly as COVID-19 acts as a strong headwind to global economic activity. For example, declining commodities prices, lower exports, and decline in private consumption, less private investment, less FDI, more debt, and so on. Moreover, Africa's rapid demographic growth is drawing increasing international attention, as it will have a significant impact on societies, economic performance, political stability, and geopolitics, affecting not only the region, but the rest of the world as well. If opportunities to foster development are there, so are challenges, meaning no actor can tackle them alone. That's the reason why involving the private sector is essential for inclusive growth and the sustainability of development processes. Failing to address these issues would translate in enduring poverty and social disruption that could spill over across borders, creating instability in the region. We are fortunate today to have a keynote speaker and 4 panelists for this session. For the keynote, we are delighted to have Mrs. Ron Osman Omar. She is the officer in charge of the Industry Division, Department of Trade and Industry in the African Union. She's been in the African Union Commission since 2016. She advocates for Africa's industrial development to enable the accelerated industrial development for Africa. She supervised the development of the African Union Small and Medium Enterprise Strategy. Our panelists are Lynn Johnson. She's the president of Kamasa Incorporated. Dr. Johnson has served as a consultant and advisor to various institutions, national governments, and international organizations on issues related to finance and development. She also served for 20 years. She has over 20 years of experience in the Federal Reserve System of the United States. We have Hubert Danso. He's the CEO and chairman of Africa Investor, chairman of the CFA New York Society Global Asset Owners Advisory Council, chairman of the African Sovereign Wealth and Pension Fund Leaders Forum, and chair of the African Union Development Agency, head of State Continental Business Network. Dr. Thomas Sales is the UNDP Private Sector Special Advisor, SDG Financing in the Africa Hub sector, Pretoria. He led the design, development, negotiation, and development of the African Facility for Inclusive Markets. We also have Ricardo Ferreira. He's the interim head of corporate and investment banking, SBA. His previous roles included head of client coverage, head of business development, private sector, SBA, regional executive head for Lusophone Africa at the Nedbank, and senior manager advisory services for PwC. We have two excellent moderators. We have Salim Valimamadi, who's a professor at the Catholic University in Luanda, and Joel Costa, a journalist at a Jornal Expansão in Angola. To get the session started, I will ask Mrs. Omar to say a few words. Salim will then ask the first question to the panel. Go ahead, Mrs. Omar.
Dear moderators, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good evening from Addis Ababa. I'm pleased to be joining you for the Global Strategic Platform Africa session under the theme Africa after COVID-19, Private Sector Development. As you already know, I am in the Africa Union Commission in the Department of Trade and Industry in the Division of Industry. So you can imagine that I will talk to you about Africa industrialization, small and medium enterprises, Africa private sector, and how we engage in, and maybe, not maybe, and surely, how we are preparing to the fourth Africa, to the fourth revolution, industrial revolution. Before we reflect on the post-COVID recovery and the role of the private sector, it's imperative that we review where we are and how the pandemic has affected the African economic, where trade and industry are concerned. The coronavirus has caused havoc on global economic activities, resulting in a materially adverse impact on global capital markets, a severe disruption to trade and global supply chain, and of course, creating a negative effect on global public health. The COVID-19 highlighted the critical gaps in Africa's productive and manufacturing capacities, as well as the need to build domestic, regional, and continental value and supply chains. Africa's main trading partners in Europe and Asia were among the hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has resulted in the disruption of supply chain due to lockdowns across the globe. As a result, Africa found itself without access to essential goods at a pivotal time, as certain of the producing countries banned exportation in order to save for their own population. We have seen a lot of African countries on the continent respond to the pandemic with the local production of essential goods in food and health, with local manufacturers repurposing, producing masks, hand sanitizers, soaps, ventilators, as well as rapid testing kits. This is an exciting development for the continent, as it indicates the potential for our manufacturing sector. Ladies and gentlemen, the African private sector has a major role to play in supporting governments to defeat COVID-19 in Africa. It's important that the private sector invest in programs which support the healthcare industry as well as business continuity throughout this period and beyond. The African Union Commission, the Department of Trade and Industry, where I am, has engaged the Africa private sector and financial institutions as part of an initiative to strengthen and upscale the capacity of the African productive sector in order to supply African countries during COVID and beyond. Working with stakeholders in the private sector and financial institutions, the DTI has embarked on a mapping exercise to identify Africa's productive capacity. Stakeholders engaged include Afro-Champion Initiative, the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, PASI, the Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, the Interim Steering Committee of the Pan-African Manufacturer Association, the Afrexim Bank, and others, together forming a working group that will seek to produce a mapping study toward developing a collective response to the pandemic. Furthermore, the DTI is working on establishing trade corridors where AUC member states would liberalize trade on all essential goods in order to facilitate the free movement of said goods during the pandemic. In order to drive this forward, it's key to have a clear understanding on what each country is able to produce and at what capacity, which is where the mapping study and input from the private sector will be key. The private sector, the African Union interacts with and listens to the African private sector. It's our key partner in sustainable development and a source of investment, innovation, and jobs, among others. We regularly work with platforms like the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce and Industry, the Afro-Champion Initiative, the Pan-African Private Sector Trade and Investment Committee, and we're helping the establishment of the Pan-African Manufacturer Association, as we truly believe that a cooperation and collaboration between African manufacturers will provide an opportunity for the private sector on the continent to work together to enhance their competitiveness by lobbying policymakers to improve business environment for the benefit of the continent. And that an African Manufacturer Association is a key institutional resource, a vehicle that will anchor a private sector driven initiative to mobilize the continent's manufacturing capacity to deliver on Africa's industrialization and structural transformation agenda. The Department of Trade and Industry in the African Union Commission is also championing a strategic Pan-African private sector initiative to rally the continent's enterprises to work closely with the executive in shaping industrial policy that seek to enhance productivity, competitiveness, and business viability. It's set to be an energetic dialogue that brings together head of states, African business leaders, African policymakers and lawmakers, and civil society heads to identify how to mobilize all stakeholders to achieve active and efficient business activities in the ACFTA market. We hosted the first ACFTA Business Forum in the margin of the 10th Extraordinary Assembly in Kigali, Rwanda, when we launched the establishment of the ACFTA. The second Africa Business Forum, ACFTA Business Forum, was held when the operational phase of the ACFTA Treaty was launched by the African Union Assembly in July 2019 in Niamey, Niger, on the margin of the 12th Extraordinary Summit on the ACFTA. And we are planning to have the third edition of the ACFTA Business Forum as a virtual forum on the margin of the next Extraordinary Summit, which is scheduled in December 2020. This third ACFTA Business Forum, E-Forum, is intended to focus stakeholders on the ACFTA. With the head of states and private sector CEOs, the forum will build the momentum and motivation as we head toward the start of trading. Position the ACFTA as essential to the Africa's recovery from the COVID-19 and invigorate stakeholders to identify their roles in the success of the ACFTA. We're also working with the Africa Export-Import Bank, the Afrexim Bank, on the Intra-Africa Trade Fair as a means of bringing African manufactured goods closer to the African people. The first edition of the Intra-Africa Trade Fair was held in December 2019 in Cairo, Egypt. With a resounding success, the event witnessed the largest trade fair held on the continent, with 1,100 exhibitors, more than 300 speakers from over 45 countries, and 32 billion US dollar deal made in trade and investment deals signed. The second edition of the ACFTA is postponed to September 2021 and is planned to be held in Kigali, Rwanda. Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you a few words about our efforts on industrialization and economic diversification. The AUC developed Africa, the action plan for the accelerated industrial development of Africa that was published in 2007. The African Mining Vision in 2009 to promote added beneficiation from the continent's vast mineral resources. The action plan on boosting intra-Africa trade in 2012 with 7 clusters on one of which is focused on developing productive capacity as well as addressing supply side constraints. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is the latest program as part of the action plan of the boosting intra-Africa trade, which is the lowest in the globe, around 17%. We're also in the process of designing a commodity strategy to accelerate value addition. The starting of the trade under the ACFTA was scheduled in July 2020, but was postponed due to the COVID to the 1st January of the 2021. The ACFTA will boost the intra-Africa trade by increasing the economic viability of industrialization on the continent and accelerating structural transformation with appropriate positive effect on product diversification. The development of regional value chain in Africa depend on the implementation of national and regional industrial policy that promote diversification in the range of good produced, both intermediate and final. The productivity level in Africa are still very low, and African economies still largely depend on commodity production and exports. The continent can leverage its natural resources endowment to unleash high value chain manufacture and diversification of production, thus invariably cushioning Africa's from exposure to external shocks. Structural transformation can create prosperity for Africa by shifting financial, natural, and human resources from low productive agrarian or resource-based sector to more productive industrial and service-based sector. Few words on SMEs. Recognized because more than 19% of African businesses are small and medium enterprises, and recognizing the importance of private sector-led growth in contributing to the Africa's economic development. The 20th ordinary session of the African Union Conference of African Ministers of Industries identified industrialization as the basis for development, with the private sector playing a critical role in supporting sustainable industrialization in order to harness the potential for industrialization to contribute to Africa's economic development. The African Ministers Conference directed the member states to create an enabling environment for the creation and operation of a small and medium-sized enterprise and small and medium-sized industries, and place the SMEs at the center of a private sector-led development. And as a part of the efforts to inspire economic growth and transformation on the continent, the African Union Commission has developed an SME strategy that was adopted early 2019. The vision of the AU SME strategy is to develop competitive, diversified, and sustainable economies underpinned by dynamic entrepreneurial and industrial sector to generate employment, reduce poverty, and foster social inclusion. The AUC strategy on small and medium-sized enterprise was adopted in 2019. And in addition to the SME strategy, the AUC is working on an Enterprise Africa network. The main endeavor will be to facilitate and grow a pool of competitive SMEs in Africa. SMEs at different stage, incubation and startups, expansion, growth stage, and maturity stage, will receive support from a pool of accredited business development service organization to build their capacity. The platform's overall goal is to provide Africa business startups and SMEs with trade information, business development services through mentoring, coaching, and access to finance for their growth and development journey. Youth entrepreneurship is more than ever a key area of development to be prioritized. Africa has some of the world's fastest growing economy with a dynamic large youth population. The continent's demographic present that the proportion of the youth is high and continue to rise. This is a source of economic vitality if we effectively harness the demographic dividend by creating opportunities for our youth. However, Africa has far struggled to take full advantage of this rising youth. Where youth is concerned, most African countries are faced with the challenge of having too many graduated to a limited number of jobs as they struggle to absorb young people into decent work opportunities. Given the deepening crisis of youth unemployment on the continent, entrepreneurship serves as an opportunity for young people to become employer rather than employee. It encourages them to be problem solver within their economy as they can create employment and contribute directly to their country's growth and development. Labor economists predict that in less than 10 years, 70% of jobs will require deep and specific technical skills, and that 65% of today's primary school students will perform jobs that haven't been invented yet. Ladies and gentlemen, intelligence is the ability to adapt to change, to overcome the fear of millions of jobs that will disappear as a result of more automated and machine intelligent process. We need to prepare the future generation for the technological demand of tomorrow and plan for the future success. We know that the African youth is getting ready for the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution. We can find them like Mustafa Sisi as head of Google and Artificial Intelligence Center, or like Kwaku Manswa running online platform where only made in Africa products are sold. The Trade Online Africa platform. Thousands of them developing innovative solutions for Africa problems every day. This is also why African Union Commission is dedicating a pavilion to the Africa Youth Startups at the second edition of the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. The ITAF Youth Startup Pavilion should be catering for 150 startups sponsored from the continent, and participants will be drawn from all countries and regions of the continent that have developed innovative ideas of addressing Africa's value chain challenges. The fourth industrial revolution offers exciting opportunities for African manufacturers and small and medium enterprises to create new business models and integrate into global value chain, however, benefiting from the industry 4.0 requires overcoming a myriad of obstacles. The African continent still lags behind both developed and other developing countries in several indicators essential for capitalizing on the fourth industrial revolution, especially in infrastructure, technology access, and education. This year, on the 9th February, 2020, the African Union Head of States and Government adopted the Digital Transformation Strategy for Africa. One of the most important specific objectives is build inclusive digital skills and human capacity across the digital science, judiciary, and education, both technical and vocational, to lead and power digital transformation, including coding, programming, analyzing, security, blockchain, machine learning, artificial intelligence, robotic engineering, innovation, entrepreneurship, and technology policy and regulation. Hope that it will be implemented as it needs to be. As emphasized by the current chairman of the African Union, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, the digital age provides an opportunity to build an entrepreneurship state and find fertile grounds for companies to succeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I end here wishing you a successful discussion in the upcoming hour. I also thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Osman, for those wonderful words. I will then ask Salim to ask the first question to the panelists.
Many thanks, Asir. Many thanks, Ms. Ron, for your very rich intervention. We shall go to the first round of questions with the panel members, and we'll talk about the private sector development. As it was referred before, the population of Africa is growing very fast. On one hand, this can bring lots of opportunities in business, but on the other hand, we know that the private sector development has many challenges, like legal framework, like bad governance, low level of education, and so on. So what measures that the governments should take to promote the private sector, the economies, and overcome the COVID-19 impact? I'll address this question to Thomas Sales. Thomas, what kind of measures that the government can take to overcome these kind of challenges? Can you also give us some examples of success cases in Africa? Thomas?
Good afternoon, good evening to some of you, depending where you are. I would like at the outset to thank the organizers for this webinar and express our deep gratitude for the opportunity to be part of it. I see a lot of friends here, and I want to pledge from the outset our utmost contribution and support to this initiative. In response to the question you posed, I see a myriad of issues. The first is the COVID challenge being faced by African governments and how to boost the private sector role in the economy and the lessons. In that context, let me start by stating that the COVID-19 is first a health pandemic, as declared by the WHO in last January. And in accordance with the CDC Africa, the figures today, COVID affects a total of 1,186,000 Africans. There are 27,322 deaths and 889,388 recoveries. Southern Africa, followed by North Africa, West Africa, Eastern Africa, are the areas most affected. In this regard, the main challenge for African countries is the need to boost up government management, response, and readiness, and to address the weak health systems and equipment shortage, including testing capacities. With this global reach and the lockdowns, COVID has also become a major economic and is gradually emerging, creating humanitarian situations. In economic terms, which directly speaks to the private sector challenge to COVID, has resulted in the following specific challenge: reduce overall GDP growth to negative minus 5%, an estimated 29 million people moving into extreme poverty. This is revealed in an AUC report. And also, we observe an average household welfare losses in the range of 7 to 14%. This scenario further undermines the African countries' aspirations to implement Agenda 2063 as well as SDGs, including the very first SDG, which concerns the eradication of poverty. Another manifestation of the challenge on COVID, we are observing, according to the World Bank, the first ever economic recession for Africa in 25 years. Agricultural production is contracting to 2.6 to 7%, and this combines with erosion of food import capability, a potential to create a severe food security crisis. The debt situation has worsened with a crippling crisis for at least 8-9 countries. For instance, we know Angola has got a growing external debt service over 400%, Nigeria 270%, South Africa over 100%. There is increased domestic price volatility and pressures for inflation. We have the case of large unemployment and informal sector economy disruption. It is estimated that 20 million jobs will be at risk due to supply chain disruptions. And even more of critical importance, the informal sector, which employs 80% of workers in Africa, their livelihoods are being affected critically. You should think about the informal traders that sell processed fresh food and goods. You should think about the providers of service from hairdressing, informal workers, tailoring, weld and carpentry. You should talk about the street vendors. All of these constituencies have been affected, and so their livelihoods. Key export commodities have seen a price slump, including, of course, oil, but as well as the traditional commodities exported from Africa. There are even more direct shocks in the aviation, tourism, and hospitality industries, which are risking bankruptcy and closure. And above all of this results in a situation where African governments see reduced domestic finance resources and limited financial space. Liquidity is a big headache. The question that relates to the point you went, how to boost the private sector role in the economy and the lessons. African governments and the AU and the African Union at the regional level have not been asleep despite the underlying challenge and the magnitude. The principal observed response consists in the adoption of specific package of national policies, precautionary measures, and other responses to address the immediate health gap needs, and a set of complementary relief programs to keep the economic players afloat. These initiatives, however, are not commensurate with the urgent need to provide additional and enough liquidity to save the Africa private sector and to create a new and deeper mutual win-win partnerships. There is also a need to conceptualize and facilitate measures leading to comprehensive reform to transform the relationship between government and the private sector towards an objective of building back better and in an inclusive, greener, digital aligned and resilient economy, relying more on localization and regional integration production paradigm. There are several private sector development strategies now being developed all across Africa, including the recent adoption of a series of COVID recovery plans. I can talk about two cases that I know closely and follow. In Eswatini, the government is implementing an economic response recovery plan that seeks to improve the overall macroeconomic conditions, creation of jobs, and fast-track government revenue mobilization. The main idea is we need to rely on our own private sector, and we need to create the enabling conditions for stronger and embedded cooperation. In South Africa, a 500 billion rand stimulus package was implemented, and several economic relief measures to help small business, such as the Debt Relief Finance Scheme and the Business Growth Resilient Facility. While these measures provide short-term relief, they are still a great challenge, including delays in payments, complications in applications, requirement of financial records and paperwork. In general, we should notice that Africa doesn't have enough liquidity and capacities to address and protect jobs and cover increasing deficits. While an economic stimulus and liquidity injection is urgent to project jobs, there is a need to think long-term. There is a need to have a better strategy. And this better strategy should include, based on the lessons, the following elements: financial restructuring, restructuring of government budget to decrease financial deficits, address the debt challenge, and facilitate conditions for relief, recovery, and reposition of the economy. Target initiatives in the productive sectors are very important, especially those that directly involve the private sector, and should be part of the process, including leveraging the recently international financial institutions stimulus funding. It shouldn't be a business between the government and the financial institutions. It should be government, civil society, but as well as the private sector. We see great opportunities in this time of COVID in the area of addressing the typical issues of food self-sufficient, manufacturing, the green economy, digital transformation, seizing opportunities on regional trade and integration. The second area of action relates to institutional frameworks. There is a need to reconsider government as the unique and central enabler of growth, and eventually addressing the institutional bottlenecks for allowing the ease of business and attracting finance, both through domestic resource mobilization, incentives to entrepreneurship, just to agree with our colleague from the African Union, enterprise development service, and public-private partnerships. This may include improving and financing structures, including digital infrastructure, improving the procedures and time it takes to start business and their registration, and attracting investment by improving and enhancing the predictability of business environment and other forms of de-risking. Given the dominant size and role of the informal sector in most African countries, is also critical to put in place a robust and integrated solutions to support the recovery and greater formalization of informal enterprises and workers based on incentives, including the introduction of relevant, feasible social protection solutions. The third pillar for recovery is investing on youth and micro and small sizes empowerment. Many African countries are grappling with high levels of unemployment exacerbated by COVID, as I mentioned previously, and thus are trying to put in place strategies to empower job creation that involve the participation and should target youth and women, particularly young women. This can be done through public procurement strategies that specifically target micro and small enterprises, strengthen entrepreneurial education of youth, and also work on the mindset to become job creators, provide cash injection in the most affected areas in COVID that, again, that I mentioned before. A fourth pillar and critical one is the question of innovation. While COVID has disrupted external supply chains in Africa and affected food security and the availability of crucial healthcare supplies, this offers also a unique opportunity for encourage local innovation. Already in Africa, there are many examples of young entrepreneurs developing their own PPEs and ventilators and ways of delivering telemedicine. The government can consider how to encourage African startups and how to scale innovative solutions across the continent. There is especially a need for the development of new private sector business models and innovative financial products and solutions that target the market of the majorities, meaning the market for most of the population. We at the UNDP have been working on this space in several African countries and have some good lessons and tools to engage the private sector. In Uganda, Malawi, Namibia, for instance, we are supporting the preparation of youth entrepreneurs and facilitating the direct access to financial institutions. We also deploy the ecosystem development approach in the areas of solar energy, digital, money, and tourism to address big systemic challenges from within the ecosystem, while maximizing the contribution and potential of the private sector to solve those challenges. We work very strongly in the new space in terms of finance, what we call SDG investments, with the participation of the private sector. We are helping several African countries to identify SDG investment opportunities, and together with the government, private sector, and local communities, create blended solutions and mobilize global investors. In conclusion, the existing initiatives are good, but it's work in progress. We need to be much more urgent. We need to take much more collective action and look for impact. The main goals should be twofold: the urgent need to provide additional and urgent liquidity to save the African private sector, and to create a new, deeper, and mutual win-win trust-based relationship. There is a need to conceptualize and facilitate collaboration, leading to comprehensive reform to transform the relationship between government and the private sector, with the objective of building back better with an inclusive, greener, digital aligned, and resilient economy, while relying more on local and regional business models. As a development partner officer, we are keen to support this new type of engagement, where the private sector brings this contribution and becomes an agent, an active agent for transformation, which we believe it's a major part of the solution if we need to address the present COVID crisis and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Thomas. I just wanted to remind that we should take into account the time. We should not spend more than 5 minutes to respond of each of questions, okay?
Sorry.
Please, go forward.
Thank you, Salian. Thank you, Thomas. Very interesting about these 4 pillars that you were explaining. Very interesting. Let's move forward and take the next question to the private sector. Hubert Danso. Hubert, one of the key challenges for African countries is diversified economy, and competitiveness is also one high-tech. What we would like you to explain is what are the most promising industry sectors? We are talking about the Africa champions across the continent. What sectors, Hubert, do you consider as the promising industries and the Africa champions? This is the first question. There is also a second question for you, Hubert. Specifically, what are the industries that you see that can have the capacity to have a major economic impact? Is it possible to follow an Asian model? Hello, Hubert?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much, Joel. And I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in this important and interesting event. And of course, welcome all colleagues and my dear sister from the African Union Commission for all of the important and hard and impactful work that's been pursued and initiated with the African private sector. I think it's a very interesting question that you've raised, Joel, one that we in the African private sector and the investment community take very seriously. As you know, I chair the African Union Development Agency's Continental Business Network, where we focus predominantly on how do we mobilize institutional capital, private sector, as well as public sector pension fund capital, as well as sovereign wealth and sovereign wealth fund capital to support development on the continent. And this has been one of the big areas where we've been driving a number of consultations in relation to how do we as an industry of asset owners of long-term institutional capital, how do we play a role in the overall current circumstances and all of the challenges that have been eloquently laid out by our good colleague from the African Union Commission, as well as Thomas. So I won't go over those again. I think we will understand that we are in a challenged economic situation and environment. But I think one of the key things that have come out of this is, before we start looking at all the levels of sophisticated economic, financial, and industrial, instruments at our disposal from a policy standpoint, I think we certainly need to think about philosophy. And one of the things that we sort of really need to address, and we've been looking at in terms of being able to deploy capital, is, what type of model have we been working to in the past, and to what extent is there political and private sector willing to cast that aside? Because we believe that the COVID-19 approach has really, it represents a great opportunity for the continent to go from a candle to a light bulb moment. Our biggest concern is that we dust off very old plans and proposals, job creation strategies that didn't even take account of the fourth industrial revolution or robots taking place of some of our productive human capital and capacity. So we think that we certainly have to reset the relationship and the opportunity between the private sector and governments, where we can really unlock a very significant win-win scenario. Our biggest concern, which is also a fear, is that we miss the opportunity by failing to understand that we have to completely transform the policy partnership that we have in terms of pursuing private sector development. And the key here is we use the phrase as if private sector development simply just means working with the private sector. I recall in some institutions when we started looking at private sector development, in some of the larger multilateral institutions, the African Private Sector Development Department was not even about helping the private sector, it was about actually helping governments regulate how the private sector participates in opportunities, because there was a grave lack of trust. So I think that we certainly welcome the African Union Commission's leadership and embrace of all of these different forward-leaning initiatives. And I say this to make the point that we believe that the African Union Commission is really going from a candle to a light bulb moment in terms of its relationship with the private sector. But when you look at the issues around import substitution and the fact that the continent is effectively one of the largest donors in the world, we sell off a lot of our goods and our assets and our resources to enrich OECD markets. And then, on the back of that, we enter into conversations about aid and how we can receive aid that, is far less than the actual value that we've exported in the form of import substitution, and then we don't beneficiate some of our goods. So we think that, again, we really need to be much more forceful in the way that we renegotiate some of our relationships, some of our bilateral as well as our cross-continental relationships. The regulatory environment is the ultimate aim here in terms of enabling us to be able to get some certainty around the terms against which we can invest. And that's not just investing from a financial standpoint, that's also investing in the necessary human capital to be able to deliver on the African Continental Free Trade Area, the Program for Infrastructure Development for Africa, ensuring that we achieve the Africa that we want in the context of Agenda 2063. These are things that really matter to us as the African private sector and as the African institutional investment community. So if you look at the key intra-African trade issues, we know the statistics, less than 16%, for trade. But then when you look at intra-African investment and you compare it with intra-European investment as an example, intra-African investment is less than 7%. That's one African country investing in another. Whereas on the OECD levels, when you statistics, when you look at Europe and those others, you're talking north of 70% intra-European investment, for example. So we have to bring some of these things together and create a hospitable policy environment to really unlock that capital. I think that's very important. Now, when we talk about trade, we have to start looking at industries like logistics. How do we transport our goods within borders and across borders? And we have a platform where we work with all of the institutional players that are supporting the logistics industry. And if you look at road freight, for example, some of the data suggests that road freight in Africa, on average, because of some of the bureaucratic and regulatory challenges, our average truck of essential goods moves at, on average, 6 miles per hour. So these are some of the underlying practical things that we really want to be able to address in terms of our private sector development, because there's a critical philosophical understanding around the regulator's role. We see it on two limbs. One part of the regulator's role is to control and protect the market. But there's another component which is equally as important, which is to develop the market. The markets around the world that are booming, even in light of a lot of the challenges, are the ones where a great deal of emphasis, or a greater deal of emphasis from the regulators, is on how do we develop the market, as opposed to how do we control it. So we think on the continent, as it relates to private sector development, the more we can work with regulators and technology to place greater emphasis on the regulator's mandate to develop the market, and then as opposed to just controlling it, we think would be very, very impactful and useful. But in terms of some of the industries, I think they're very well known to most parties. Most arable land in the world that has the opportunity to be able to not only feed Africa, but the rest of the world. So right across the value chains in agribusiness are particularly important. And of course, we're mindful of food security not just being an Africa challenge, but it's also a global challenge. So I think with the right partnerships with the public and the private sector there, as we move into this post-COVID multipolar world, and we're buoyed by the fact that we've got a very dynamic African continental free trade area framework. And the genius in that is that we have all of the ingredients to be able to not only significantly meet the goals within an intra-African context, but with the right thinking and the right strategies, we can certainly significantly increase our share of global trade from that sort of minuscule 2% average where we are now to something much more strategic and much more beneficial to not only our own private sectors and our own markets and the jobs that we will create on the back of that, but also to the world. We need, representing our own population as a percentage of the world population, we should have a much more significant component of that global trade flow. The other area is obviously healthcare. And we have a lot of digital health expertise, mobile health, the pharmaceutical, intellectual property, local, epidemiology. We have a lot of expertise that we've been harnessing, whether it's tuberculosis, malaria, occupational health. There's a lot of different linkages there that we can develop within the continent, as well as export some of those practices. And finally, just on the industries point, we often talk about the infrastructure deficit in the continent, whether it's the 50 billion per annum for the next 10 years, or it's 100 billion per annum for the next 10 years. What we see around the world is a lot of capital is actually earning, and particularly in OECD markets, earning negative returns. And when you begin to look at the returns available and the infrastructure stock and needs on the continent, there's, one of the big areas that we should really be targeting is how do we attract global infrastructure capital? Again, on a risk-adjusted return basis, we have one of the most opportune markets on a global basis for capital, and we really need capital right now. And we also really need the infrastructure and the jobs and the trade flows that get catalyzed off of strategic transport, trade-related, logistics, industrial infrastructure, which again buoys our private sectors capacity. And I think those are some of the big areas that we would highlight as being very important. Thank you.
Many thanks, Hubert, and we'll pass on to next questions addressed to Wileen Johnson. Wileen, we heard Hubert saying that we need urgently external capital, but one of the main challenges is to attract the foreign direct investment to Africa, outside from extractive sectors like oil and mining. Investors still consider investing outside oil and mining, like sectors in agriculture, manufacturing, very risky. So what are your suggestions for governments to improve the foreign direct investments in the African countries? What the governments can do to improve and to increase this for foreign direct investment, or to attract this foreign direct investment?
Thank you very much, Professor. And I'd like to, first of all, thank the Africa Sessions for giving us a chance to really look at these issues in depth. And you ask about what can governments, and I will actually focus a lot on regional organizations, what policy changes can be made to encourage investment outside of the extractive industries sector. Well, I think perhaps one of the most important things relates to the whole issue of the way taxes and royalties are paid or not paid. One of the problems that has endured for decades has been that of base erosion and profit sharing, and the OECD is now paying a lot of attention to that. What we've seen in the past has been the extractive industries haven't paid enough in terms of the royalties to begin with for their exploration, nor have they paid enough in taxes. And so this has meant that African countries have been at a disadvantage in terms of having the resources to provide for the education and the well-being, health, and other services of well-being. If the OECD estimates that there's 100 billion to 240 billion a year shortfall in tax payments from these multinationals, you can be sure that the greatest impact is felt in the African countries. And so that's just a bit of background in terms of the movement away from extractive industries. I was pleased to see recent research by Dr. Muazu Ibrahim, who's part of the University for Development Studies in Ghana. He's actually given us measurements of the degree of structural transformation in individual African countries. So looking at agriculture, manufacturing, and services as a part of the entire economic activity in an individual country. What he points out is that in order to have the structural transformation in Africa, one needs to have free trade. And I think everyone has agreed that that is a goal. But I'd like to emphasize that the importance of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and actually developing free trade will lead to structural transformation. This comes from changes in the production in the individual countries, but also because Africa will develop regional supply chains. And we've seen throughout the world, COVID has highlighted the lack of flexibility in our supply chains and the resulting shortages that have come from that. So for this change to take place at the country level, there need to be regional policy actions. I think that Mr. Salas has mentioned the issue of liquidity. I'm encouraged that the African Central Bank Network, the Association for African Central Banks, has created an interregional payments integration task force that is now working on integrating the Southern African, Eastern African, and West African countries. There are those in 3 areas where they first have gotten payments flows among the countries within the area, and they're now working on establishing flows between the 2 groups will start, and then all the groups. This is absolutely necessary for free trade to take place. I've also seen that there are regional programs to promote the mobilization of domestic revenue. We just heard from Hubert that Africa is responsible for aiding the rest of the world. There are outflows from Africa that outweigh the inflows. What we'd like to do is see if those domestic resources can be harnessed for African development. Part of this involves the issue that we discussed with tax revenue, but it also means developing savings and local currency bond markets, ways to raise money on that local level. And of course, I was on the board of the African Development Bank, and that was a very important initiative that the African Development started, even issuing its own bonds in the currencies of African countries. The African Union and other regional groups are supporting reform efforts. I think many of us use the World Bank's Doing Business report as a way of measuring progress in domestic reforms, domestic policies that help to promote business. And I think I want to say also that in terms of philosophy, that business that I'm talking about is one that would be sustainable, would have profits, but where the business would be for the benefit of the people of Africa, not only for the business owners, whether they be foreigners investing in Africa or Africa's investing in their own countries. Looking at those measures of doing business, several to me are particularly important. My background is banking, so obviously I'm particularly interested in those aspects of the doing business reforms that relate to providing credit. And high on the list would be registering property, creating credit bureaus, but also just the countries being sure that contracts are enforced. And also that minority investors have their rights protected. These are some of the measures that you can see have taken a very important role in the measuring progress on that doing business. The other very important one that they measure is paying taxes, and I think we've already spoken about that. And so if we look at individual countries, and of course anyone who's followed these reforms knows that Rwanda has made the swiftest but also the steadiest progress, so that now the country that is judged most open for business is Mauritius, with Rwanda behind it, Kenya and South Africa following. And if you look at the detailed reports, you'll see that in terms of Mauritius and Rwanda, particular attention has been paid in reforming those regulations that relate to getting credit and registering property, so that not only can you start a business, and I think we've mentioned that 90% of the African businesses, Madam Osman mentioned, 90% of them are small businesses. You can actually grow a business if you have that access to credit and you have good corporate finance. And so I'd like to leave it there, but I think we'll actually end up extending the discussion as we move further along. Thank you.
Thank you, Wylian. Let's go to the last question of this first round. Just reminding that the first round is about African private sector challenges. And the last question goes to Ricardo Ferreira. Ricardo, productive infrastructure is vital for the development in Africa. However, access to funding continues to be a significant issue. Well, as Hubert, as well Thomas said, access to funding and liquidity is the huge problem. How can the private investor play a more significant role in response to these challenges? And what advantages and risks are in implementing PPPs? Can you foresee? Ricardo,
yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to chat to all of you today. I think I'll approach the answer with some context and some suggestions. It's mostly an issue resulting out of government intervention. African governments are generally experience high public debt to GDP ratios, which obviously curtails their ability to provide sovereign balance sheets and roll out infrastructure projects. This challenge precedes the COVID-19 crisis. So we get from a World Bank report that presents the case that only 17% of infrastructure projects are financed by the private sector. In sub-Saharan Africa, 95% of all infrastructure is financed by SOEs or the sovereigns. So the private sector generally tends to play a role on the management side and technical expertise. And good examples of these can be found across Africa. A world caliber example could be considered the South African renewable sector that raised over 5.5 billion, as well as nearby the Maputo port concession that's run by the Biport Worlds is a good example. So from a private sector perspective, there tends to be a focus on energy, as in particular on greenfield projects. This is not surprising, as these tend to be relatively quick to construct and have quick recoupment of investments. The water sector does not appeal that much because there's high input costs and low cost recovery levels. On the telecom side, the private sector achieves 76% participation due to a well-regulated environment and defined cost capital recovery models. So what are the good examples of countries where we have good private sector participation infra? These could be unusual names that maybe we're not familiar with: Cambodia, Mongolia, Philippines, Ghana, Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. And this is generally attributed to policies aimed at private sector participation. So what can governments do to improve this mismatch between the demand and supply? Well, they need to roll out a strategy with assistance of expert parties that have a proven track record in PPP funding or advisory. One has to have a plan in place in order to execute it. So I'll leave you with some key takeaways that are generally able to be implemented without much cost. and that certainly, if adopted on a larger scale, could alleviate this gap in infrastructure demand. The first one would be an open policy stance on infrastructure investment and implementing value for money offices. These would provide a view on which projects are adequately priced and fit for purpose, and would create a transparent environment that the private sector appreciates. Data sets are generally inadequate, not only from macro perspective to allow banks and investors to take a view, but also to get a sense of opportunities. So statistic institutes must be beefed up and incentivized to disclose as much as possible. The asymmetry of information is a capital flow detractor. Investment committees need information to deliberate whether it is a good allocation of capital resources. We should also focus on education strategies that need to be revisited in order to ensure that total factor productivity is achieved. In addition to that, and I think the colleagues have said, there's a need for policy setting. Most governments do not have adequate policy setting officers nor budgets to man them, and that should be considered. With regards to PPP rollout, it is incredibly important to have civil society associated in the monitoring of the rollout of PPPs, so in order to ensure that effective execution takes place. Another common issue that affects PPP participation is unrestricted ownership or access to land where projects are located. I've heard colleagues discuss this from a land property perspective. Governments should evaluate land policy in order to incentivize domestic and foreign investment in projects. And another factor would be based on documentation. The more regulated the environments are, the better it is to incentivize the entry of private sector capital. A risk-sharing protocol should also be pursued, and the risks should be allocated to the party most appropriately positioned to deal with it. For example, a private investor is not well placed to deal with risks arising from macro challenges, and similarly, public stakeholders should not bear the risk of a poor performing PPP. The last keyword in PPPs is trust. Governments should work incessantly on creating trust. Trust is the bridge to all forms of capital. For trust to exist, we need ethics and government. So the countries that implement these consistently will win the race. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Let's go to the second round about Africa integration and private sector engagement. Well, one of the main flagships project of African Union is the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA. That's however, intra-African trade currently accounts for only 18% of overall trade on the continent. What we would like to understand, Hubert Danso, the next question goes to you, is over the long term, do you think that African countries will benefit from shifting supply chains and having more products made in Africa?
Thank you very much, Joel. Absolutely. I think we don't have any choice. I think everywhere around the world has recognized and is contending with the outfall of these sovereign supply chains, recognizing the high degrees and levels of dependence on external inputs. Notwithstanding the fact that we have both the human, the financial, and the natural resource capacity to be able to develop some of these industries and the associated infrastructure. I think also, it's one of those things where at the Continental Business Network level, we're working on this. We're currently putting together a strategy document that will be shared with the African Union Commission and other strategic partners, which is basically bringing together the logistics industry, the manufacturing industry, the finance community, the institutional investment community, about designing it. because it's not an if or, it's really, you know, what is the plan? Where do we have those strategic advantages? You know, how do we mitigate where we don't, into creating what we already know to be a fact? And unfortunately, whilst we talk about, you know, post-COVID-19, we are you know, a recurring cycle of pandemics that we are going to have to experience on the continent every 4 to 6 years. So we need to really already be anticipating the level of resilience and the lessons learned from having some of our supply chains be more externally focused than internally resilient and useful. I think, but that being said, we also need to appreciate that, you know, and we always take this global view, and I know that you mentioned sort of made in Africa, but we also need to appreciate African made is also very valuable, because we are, you know, part of a big global trading system and community that our companies have all the necessary, you know, capacities to be able to go into the global economy and compete. So we should also be encouraging our companies to be able to set up businesses internationally and compete, so that African made does not just mean that it's only made in Africa, but also African made within a global and international context. And hopefully some of those projects and transactions can actually be supported by our own institutional capital as part of the pension and the sovereign wealth fund's international allocations. So our offshore investments can actually support our companies participating and competing on a global basis internationally. And I think, you know, when you start looking at some of the ways that we've tried to conceptualize as the Continental Business Network, how to intermediate and mobilize long-term institutional capital into the types of infrastructure and the supply chains that we need, and the underlying support and facilities that our companies need, we really need to have this investability, bankability mindset as we create the regulatory environment that will assist capital flow. And that goes a long way to recognizing that we again need to enfranchise with better efforts our own stock exchanges and capital markets to be real venues to be able to, you know, assist, facilitate capital into the financing of this infrastructure and these regional supply chains that we actually need, that will be critical and key to get us to far beyond our 16% of intra-African trade where we are, and hopefully exceed the goals and the measures set by the African Continental Free Trade Area for our integrated trade. And also, as I keep mentioning, to ensure that we go far beyond this 2% of global trade. That takes a very clear focus from us to really be able to accomplish that. So yes, we think it's a very important opportunity. It's a timely opportunity. And I say this in the context that it's not everyone that actually believes around the world that that's the best strategy. So I did mention before, we're moving into a multipolar world. The concept of globalization is coming under attack. The continent is now launching probably the largest free trade area since the establishment of the World Trade Organization, a 3.2 trillion plus GDP area of economic potential. So I think now is absolutely the time to do that. And I know that we'll talk about this a bit later on, but, you know, being able to ably employ and create that hospitable environment for this to be driven largely by technology is going to be a very strategic move for us as the continent, both the public and the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Hubert. I'll hand over to Salim. Salim, would you please continue?
My next question will go to Ricardo again. Ricardo, we all agree that infrastructure is a big lack in the African continent. And mainly these infrastructure are funded by external investors. So in the current context, it seems that it will be more difficult to have access to this external funding due to the higher risk of African countries' economies. So do you believe that African investors and institutions are prepared to respond to this and to fund the infrastructure in Africa?
Thank you, Salim. Well, I think the quick answer to that is a no. But let me elaborate and see what can be done to resolve that over time. I think the one overarching comment that I see our colleagues have also made is that COVID has given us a permission to rethink. Its immense impact will create flexibility and a willingness to test new ways of work. And I think governments will be challenged to demonstrate how they can remain relevant. And they'll be required to present strategies that will address this issue. As an additional comment, infrastructure project demand certainly cannot be met by African banks. The size of banking market in general is lower than each country's GDP, which demonstrates low sophistication and penetration. So it does not have the required scale to move the needle and provide the funding required. Other obvious candidates, I'm glad to hear that Hubert is close to that matter. That will have appetite for long-term assets will be the pension funds. Pension funds generally tend to have a conservative asset allocation with a greater proportion allocated to equities and bonds. Infrastructure assets tend to be viewed as alternative investments. And so I'm of the opinion that the size and sophistication of African pension funds are not likely to meet the requirements. However, some respite can be obtained from potentially global pension funds, and some players in the African space are becoming aware of this, tapping into these global pension funds. The obvious opportunity is to match the ample liquidity that is available internationally, that is currently earning very low or even negative returns with African markets, so as to allow the government initiatives to be funded and global pension funds to allocate a small tranche of their ample liquidity to be able to pursue some of these alternative investments. So we need to collaborate and focus on providing avenues how this new risk appetite can be placed. We should also benchmark and see how it was done in other geographies. How did other countries manage to move FDI? For example, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Singapore and Thailand, they've been consistently accelerating FDI. And this is not relating to sweatshops and cheap labor. There's been a shift to finance jobs and IT. And this has been achieved by establishing a good policy environment, sensible labor laws, an attractive regulatory environment, and improving productivity as key ingredients. And the one main ingredient that I will keep on bringing across as we discuss Africa private sector is trust. Trust between investors and host countries is considered as sacrosanct. So we also should consider that Africa has got the fastest growing population in the world, and many studies show that it will be a major consumer market for years to come. So we need to consider how we position ourselves. We need this infrastructure. We need the jobs for the exploding youth that is certainly more aware than ever of the connectedness of things. So the key takeaway is that ample capital exists to be tapped. We must make sure that the environment is right for this to take place. I do actually think that the cards are being stacked in the favor of Africa, as it's seen as the last growth frontier, one that is likely to last for decades to come. So my last remark would be capital goes where it's welcome. So policymakers need to understand that and work incessantly on achieving that and making trust a part of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. The next question goes to Thomas Sales. Thomas, what factors do you consider as crucial to make this African Continental Free Trade Area agreement effective and attractive for all countries?
Thank you. I would start by saying that what we need, given the circumstances and the historical development, what we need now is leadership for early action. As you know, the agreement was signed, but there are some remaining process and protocols that have to still be negotiated. However, we think in light of COVID, and precisely because of that, we need leadership to seize the momentum and build credibility and confidence for the urgent adoption and prioritization approaches towards the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. To begin with the field implementation, by leading companies and countries, even ahead of the final legal protocols and signings, we need fundamentally somebody determined and courageous in terms of the leadership and to take action. This learning by doing and adapting is a result of the new situation created by the gap filling from COVID-19. There are opportunities related to filling the gap from global supply chains, but also there are new opportunities themselves that come as a result of COVID. I also go back and say there are three potential areas of action that we will favor this process. The first one concerns the harmonization of logistics and introduction of the fostering of digital platforms. Here, there is space to harmonize border protocols and introduce strategies on the movement of people and goods. Also, introduce digital platforms and systems among member states to reduce the paperwork delays, electronic documents, payments, e-certificates of origin and standards. There are opportunities to reduce non-tariff barriers to trade. There is a need to support the work of the regional economic commissions, as well as private sector business management organizations to serve as champion facilitators of regional economic integration, and especially regional projects where there are regional off-takers and linkage with SMEs. Also, there is opportunity to work in this space to engage and support existing and emerging players in the e-commerce space. We have some companies that have started this process, African companies, including Jumia, Takealot, Kilimmail, Konga, the BidBuy, AliExpress. We need to support these initial players in the e-commerce space, create space, and facilitate process of international joint ventures with other global players that are coming into Africa. One important critical area is investing on broadband infrastructure and make it affordable. This is a critical area where we see opportunities in terms of facilitating more commerce and creating opportunities, including for, as I mentioned before, the big issue of what happens to the informal economy. Also, another angle is to look at industrial policies. There is an absolute need to use this opportunity to strengthen productive capacity in industries, to develop for the development of value-added products, very much like our sister Ron said at the beginning, what the African Union is trying to do. We think this is critical and it's important. We also need to entice greater demand and supply of goods within the implementation of the free trade agreement. Finally, I'd like to emphasize it's important to adopt cross-border regional value chain compacts and promote made in Africa products. As you can see, we are all coming to the same thing. We need to build the local capability and the regional in order to bring back the economy and set a new trajectory. Finally, in the area of business and final interventions. I think it was Dr. Johnson who mentioned this. I think we need to promote and advance the regional payments mechanisms. SADC, for example, as an integrated regional electronic payment system. And this allows to reduce corresponding banking charges in regional trade. We need to look into providing loan facilities and other incentives and guarantee schemes at special rates for business to fund the reemergence of key industrial sectors, manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, health, logistics. And we actually need to go further and think about how do we operationalize these concepts and think about the creation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement product brands and related certification. And finally, talking about finance and business, we need to think about innovative business and forms of finance. And here, just to give you an example, there is a very interesting platform, online platform, an agri-tech called Farm Crowdy out of Nigeria, which is focused on linking suppliers of poultry products with the financial sector to support 25 of those farmers. Alongside it, they have a mechanism to mobilize crowdfunding. So the combination of new types of business and new types of finance matching, it's actually opportune for at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for your reviews. My next question will go to Dr. Johnson. China has been very important for African development, mainly for infrastructure development, for loans. On the other hand, we can see that the U.S. strategy, a new U.S. strategy, is to be more competitive and in Africa and to enter the markets where China has a strong presence. How do you think that this geostrategic competition will play out for private sector in Africa, on one hand, and the other hand, which sectors that you think that Americans can do better than China in Africa?
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's a question of doing better than for the U.S. to do better than China, but we see that if we look at the years 2000 to 2014, where we have detailed statistics, China's flows that includes aid and loans and others were 354 billion and the US 370 billion. That's to all the African countries. Well, that may look like a lot of money, but it's actually not enough. So what I'd like to see is the United States encouraging private sector investments in areas that would actually help the Chinese funds to be more effective and also encourage other flows from the United States. And I think the first thing that we'd have to do is what we were just advised that by Mr. Danos, that we should throw out old models. And the old model that needs to go is the one of tied financial assistance and tied financing. It was tied aid, and more recently, with so much of the Chinese flows being at market rates, it's a kind of tied financing where you get the financing, but you have to use a firm from that country. We've got to go to a model where the borrowing country, the borrowing firm is able to use the best methods for procurement to get the best value out of the products, the lending and the associated products. So what I would suggest is that the U.S. invest, again, we're often talking about digital platforms. I find myself echoing Mr. Sales in that we have digital platforms at the very basic level, like Twiga in Kenya, which links 17,000 rural producers and 8,000 Nairobi vendors. So that will help the deal with the issues of good nutrition and food security that all of us have referred to. But I think we also are talking about new supply chains. And so again, investing in innovations in logistics and reforms in logistics is absolutely critical. If we can get more value out of the flows that come, whether it's from China or from the United States, I think that can be best done with reforms in these individual areas, which will give us more value for any amount of money that is dispersed. Thank you.
Thank you, Wileen, for your views. We already passed the 19 minutes of program, so we're going to the third round. So I'll ask you to be very quick in your answer. I'll give you two minutes to each of you to answer. So we're going to the topic of the some experts consider that digital revolution is already taking place in Africa, specifically in the mobile phone. Hubert, do you think that, do you agree with this statement? Do you think that the other sectors will have the same level of development as the mobile phone in Africa?
Thank you, Salim. It's absolutely possible. It's going to need to be led by the private sector, where opportunities can be married with market demand, both current and future. But there are some underlying issues that we need to, and a number of the colleagues have already addressed that. So for example, the future is digital, or what one should say, the current is digital. And it really does need that enabling, regulatory and policy framework. So our focus really is in terms of the whole trade agenda, how we can accelerate, and we've had a number of consultations on this, how we can accelerate the African Continental Free Trade Area's e-commerce protocol, which is still to be negotiated. We're calling for that protocol to be accelerated in terms of when it's actually negotiated. We'd like it to be negotiated as of next year, as opposed to the year after. And as we know, that will be annexed to the main agreement. We already put together a quite detailed response after bringing together all of our digital and e-commerce related companies and investors. And our statement really put out a number of different recommendations. We consulted with, Bern Union, all the export credit and the investment insurers, the World Customs Organization, the International Chamber of Commerce, the World Trade Organization, as well as the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat. And we came up with sort of a policy statement there on behalf of the private and the private sector and the investment community that sort of is broken down into three key pillars. I won't go into all the detail, but the pillars are that, the first pillar talks about the priority trade facilitation reforms that are going to be required to boost African SME digital trade, how to get the informal traders more formal. As we know, the more e-trade and e-procurement that takes place, then you will actually be able to tax small and medium-sized enterprises or companies that are actually informal, because they'll actually be going through a formal and transparently taxed platform. The second key pillar is reforms to safeguard trade finance and export credit investment insurance through digital platforms. And then finally, the third platform just looks at investment opportunities that relate to digital infrastructure and optimizing, digital priorities and using sort of predictive tools. Again, I come back to this whole issue about keeping our eyes firmly on that sort of global market and really being able to enfranchise our diaspora. We've got a great deal of talent and expertise. It's one of the 5th regions of the African Union. We really need to, and there's a lot of great technology and innovation and IP that exists. I think we've seen one of Africa's biggest success stories is a business that's just been acquired in the multi-billion-dollar range, driven by one of the founders being from Senegal. We need to understand that there's a lot of expertise that we have within our colleagues and family members within the diaspora. And to Ricardo's point earlier, we have an opportunity, and this is something that we've partnered with the African Union on as the Continental Network. to come up with what is known as the 5% agenda, where we, as the institutional investment community, have set out a plan that begins to describe how we will be able to increase our allocations to infrastructure and trade-related infrastructure from currently less than 2% to 5%, on the understanding that we can partner with governments to create more alignment around the regulatory environment, which is much more conducive to our views and our abilities and our governance to be able to deploy long-term equity into transactions and use the capital markets. And that in itself has now catalyzed what is known as the 1% agenda, where we've placed a much heavier focus on ESG. And we've recognized that a lot of the infrastructure assets or potential upcoming opportunities on the continent that could be developed by the private sector, as opposed to transactional advisors that fly in and fly out and actually have no capacity to actually support our local, commercially focused and successful private sector project developers. So we're marrying our local private sector expertise to be able to develop this missing bankable pipeline and investable pipeline of investment opportunities with pools of multi-trillion-dollar pools of ESG focused and oriented capital. So if we can get these projects properly promoted and support our commercial private sector project developers to help create that infrastructure that's going to mobilize and facilitate trade and catalyze jobs, and that ensure that these transactions are structured in such a way that they are ESG compliant, we have access to a whole new pool of capital and a different approach than perhaps we've had with the more sort of DFI driven model that's much more about the debt as opposed to the equity side. And I think my last points are really, again, coming to this Africa in the rest of the world position. Our own trade technologies that we're innovating and developing, and these great examples that we've been talking about here about these different technologies that are facilitating trade, those technologies should be promoted internationally. We mustn't always just be the recipients of global technology and adopters. We must also compete and make our technology available in the market. We think that that's going to be a very critical piece. And we think that that should also be part of some of the discussions. I mean, we're seeing the Huawei debacle manifest itself in many forms, but we have, for a very long time, just been recipients of external technologies without forming those technology partnerships between local and international technologies, or even in some cases, promoting our own technologies from some of our, innovative, entrepreneurs and developers. So I think that's going to be a very important way for us as well to harness these additional types of opportunities that you referenced outside of just the cell phone example or the common reference to M-Pesa. There's a lot more we could do to strategically get our own technology into the rest of the world, into other emerging markets or other markets that have similar characteristics to our own. And the last point that we've heard, and I'll come back to it again, is that we must be very careful not to try to copycat OECD markets as we look to go through our own digital transformation, because there's a lot of legacy challenges that, ironically, our own underdevelopment in the digital space and the infrastructure space represents in this fast-paced day and age and knowledge economy an advantage. So we mustn't onboard other people's legacy challenges, because one of our greatest opportunities is to be able to leapfrog our way into the fourth industrial revolution as the African private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Hubert. The next question goes to Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson, do you think digitalization will increase the rate of employment in Africa and as well reduce inequalities and bring more inclusion to the continent?
Thanks very much. I'm not sure if it will necessarily increase employment, but I have a strong feeling that it will help to improve well-being. And I think I say that simply because the nature of work is changing very rapidly. And the number of jobs held by those in a population will no longer be the measure of well-being that we'll use. We'll develop a new measure. I think that we've already seen some significant improvement in well-being coming from African developed technology. I think because I've been working in the security sector, I think first and foremost of Ushahidi, which is an application that's been used in other parts of the world, but it was developed in Kenya, a way of crowdsourcing information that proved useful in Kenya in terms of preventing the spread of conflict when they were able to identify where there were local disturbances, and is being used in many places now to monitor things such as electoral events or events associated with that. We've also seen help in terms of mobile clinics by increasing the capacity of medical assistants to go out to provide care, prenatal care, well-being child, baby care, and others. People are able to get that information. During this time when so many of us are challenged by COVID, we've seen countries such as Rwanda and Kenya who have eliminated, where the companies have eliminated the charges for peer-to-peer money transfers so that we can limit the spread of infection through cash. And Rwanda introduced that in March of 2020 when there was $11 million equivalent transferred. By May, they were transferring $73 million equivalent. So saving the exposure to disease. But going forward, I think one of the most important things, and we've already heard Mr. Donald speak about the e-commerce protocols. We have to be sure that countries have in place protocols and policy recommendations to assure fairness. I think we have the East African Internet Governance Forum that has worked at ECT policy harmonization, but we need to have that in other areas so that we can prevent a bias that can come, what they call an algorithm bias, but a bias that can be embedded in the way you collect and analyze data. So it won't just happen that digital entrepreneurship will benefit people. It has to be guided through policy. Right now, and I'm fortunate that I spoke to Nicolas Federici, who advised me that the book that he and several others have written on digital entrepreneurship in Africa was just published. And those in the audience will be interested to know that it's published by MIT Press as open access. So we can all read this book about digital entrepreneurship in Africa. And I think it gives details, and it shows us that right now at the continent, we have 3 tiers of entrepreneurial ecosystems. With that highest tier, the one that's maturing, Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, is one that is already producing products and systems for the global and certainly for the cross-national market. Behind that, you have the incipient leaders groups in Accra, Kampala, Dakar, Abidjan, Yaoundé. And behind them, Kigali, Addis, and Maputo. So we see them moving from national products, a national market, to a national and nearby market, to the global market of those most mature firms. What we want to think of now is how does public policy, but also corporate self-governance, how do we have an approach that will lead to the development of technology that helps to alleviate poverty and not to widen inequalities. That's the challenge that's before us, to harness the energy that's being released by this latest digital revolution.
Many thanks, Wileen. I'll pass to the other questions to Thomas. Thomas, as you may know, the African countries has a lot of suffers of informal markets. It's very strong presence in the economies. So how do you see the impact of this technology revolution and the access to the financial services and products of these people? What is your opinion about that?
Thank you. Indeed, the informal markets, it's a big size of all the markets in most African countries. According to the last figures from ILO, corresponds to 80%. We actually, I'm in the midst of a very interesting project that aims to tackle this issue. And the issue is one of the fundamental incentives and drivers for potential formalization is working on access to finance. And when we look at the array of methods and methodologies, digital finance, it's a potential area for work. We are putting together a project looking at the whole African, Caribbean, and Pacific. And the main idea is, can we challenge the financial industry to work with these young entrepreneurs, these new, forward-looking people who would develop these applications to allow them to venture and contribute more to the informal sector. So we're putting together a competition for a blended finance mechanism where we're taking the innovators to work alongside with some established financial institutions and regulators to address the issue of how do we improve access to finance and we create the right type of products and solutions in this space. So this is one of the areas where we are increasingly focused, and probably since we are looking at the whole issue of supporting the Africa private sector. Next week, on the 26th of August, the UN Secretary General is releasing a new report on how finance can help to implement the SDGs, particularly digital finance and inclusive business models. So for the members of this panel and the audience, if you are keen to interest, I'll be more than happy to send you an invitation. It basically addresses the issue where finance should go in the 21st century to address all these big challenges, including, of course, the issue of the informal sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. And the last question goes to Ricardo Ferreira. Ricardo, African systems are notorious for the restrictiveness of their financial markets, often undercapitalized and with limited liquidity. Well, do you think that digitalization will help bring more financial integration and allow capital markets to play their full role in the financial growth, investments, and ultimately the transformation of the continent?
Thank you very much. I think we need to just define the digitization as a process of converting information into a readable format. The capital markets can certainly benefit by digitization to a certain extent. However, capital markets are a very specialized service. But there are benefits of engaging in digitization. It's quite specialized material on the origination phase, looking at data and how teams can utilize big data and data collection that will help them with advanced analytics to estimate probable book sizes, and how investor behavior can pan out. You can look at RPAs on notifications, and furthermore on the execution phase, looking at smart documentation, so putting all of that onto digitized format, putting in place digitized auctions and pricing tools. And then on the settlement side, straight through processing, including the very important digital KYC. So I think it's quite a lot that can be done here that will improve the mechanics of the capital markets. However, what we need for Africa is for basic businesses to function and to take advantage of the rollout of digitization. So I think what should be an ambition for governments across the continent would be to roll out a digital strategy that will basically see out the benefits of innovation and set sustainable economic growth. This would also address one of the issues on complexity and bureaucracy. So as countries start realizing that they must redefine themselves into future-proof models, they should revisit critical enablers of legislative and regulatory frameworks, so that they look into this fourth industrial revolution we've been talking about, so they move society into the future. So the states should play a role in shaping these ecosystems and drive the countries into a digital framework of government, economy, and society. And as such, they need to consider digital regulators, which will repurpose the current set of regulators that they have into this new concept of agile, as they become agile entities to deal with complex and cross-sector innovations, preparing for future industries and investments. So I certainly think that capital markets will take advantage of that as economies become more sustainable as a result of this innovation. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've come to the end of another very successful iteration of the Africa sessions. In fact, I would say that we have surpassed our objectives for this session, not just in terms of going over time. We were planning to spend maximum 90 minutes. We went over time. But this is a testament of the richness of both the subject. You know, this is a very, very, very important subject. When we're able to fully tap the private sector in Africa, we will do the leapfrogging that Hubert was so eloquently talking about. We are going to do that. But we've also surpassed our expectations for this session because of the richness of the interventions. Each and every one of the panelists provided just tremendous insights, not just about the realities today, but how we can shape the future. And this is really the heart of our strategy. How do we shape the future? So I was sitting here taking notes, learning a tremendous amount. Let me not go any further, of course, because we have already gone over time. But let me just thank, first of all, the panelists. My dear sister Eileen, good to see you again. New friends we've met, Ricardo, Tomas. Thank you very much, Hubert, for participating. Thank you, my dear brothers, Salim and Joel, for doing a fantastic job again, moderating. We lost our keynote speaker, but we thank her for opening the session and really laying out what's at stake and what is being done. And to the audience, thank you for hanging in there. We lost a few, but the hardcore audience stay with us to the very end. Thank you very much. My promise is to do this again in about a month's time, another important subject. Thank you again, and God bless.
Thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All the
Thank you very
best.
much.
Thanks for the insights.
Thank you. Bye.